Christian apologist Gavin Ortlund recently released a video detailing why he believes the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is compelling enough to warrant belief in this event as a miracle over and above rival naturalistic hypotheses. In this video, we'll survey Gavin's reasoning and uncover why his defense falls short of making his case. I'm a big fan of Gavin Ortlund. He's extremely measured and charitable in his interfaith dialogue as well as his interactions with non-believers. Even when one disagrees with him, one can't help but appreciate his good faith discourse and patient engagement. On top of this, given that the resurrection of Jesus is one of my favorite topics to discuss, I was all the more interested to hear Gavin's take on the historical evidence for the resurrection and how he evaluates alternative explanations. So, let's dive into Gavin's case for the resurrection, which he grounds on the foundation of 3 facts.
Or seeking to establish 3 basic facts. Number 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. Number 2, and we'll explain why that's about as certain as knowledge of ancient history can be. Number 2, his followers had experiences leading them to believe that he had risen from the dead. Now, we're not saying he did rise from the dead. We're just saying that belief arose because of experiences. And in a moment, I'm going to describe the particular quality of their testimony of that belief and why I think it has an endearing quality to it. And number 3, his burial tomb was discovered to be empty. That's the most contested one, so I'm going to take some time to make a case for the trustworthiness of the gospel accounts of the burial of Christ by Joseph of Arimathea and the subsequent discovery of the empty tomb. I think we can establish that with a high degree of probability.
It appears as if Gavin is presenting a slightly different version of the minimal facts approach for the resurrection of Jesus. He presents these 3 facts as the basis upon which to make the case for the resurrection. Though it should be noted that Gavin articulates that there are more facts that one could draw from in order to make one's case. And even though he doesn't include it in his list, he seems to include the conversion of James, the brother of Jesus, as a fact or consideration that makes more sense under the resurrection hypothesis. I'm going to grant Gavin all 3 of his facts, even the empty tomb. While the empty tomb is likely the most contested of Gavin's facts, and is the proposition that Gavin allocates the greatest amount of time to defending, I firmly believe that even granting the supposed reality of an empty tomb, the resurrection hypothesis remains feeble at best. Now, before I lay out why I believe this to be the case, I do want to survey some claims made by Gavin during his justification of these 3 facts that I believe he's flatly wrong concerning. First, Gavin makes the following claim about what Jews believed about resurrection during the 1st century.
Because a crucified Messiah is embarrassing, but so is individual bodily resurrection in the middle of history, as opposed to the final resurrection. That was not expected among Jews. They looked ahead to a final resurrection, not to a bodily resurrected Messiah in the middle of history.
This is not completely accurate. While most Jews believed in a final resurrection at the consummation of the present age, there was no solitary monolithic idea in Second Temple Judaism of resurrection and when and if it would occur. Among the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots, and those of the Qumran community, there was not complete agreement on the idea of resurrection. Moreover, scholars note that there are texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls written by a Jewish Messianic sect that conceived of some solitary resurrections before the final resurrection. But even more pertinent on this point is the witness of the Gospels themselves. According to both the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, at some point in Jesus' ministry, some believed Jesus to be John the Baptist resurrected from the dead. In fact, Herod Antipas himself is said to have remarked, upon hearing reports of Jesus' ministry, that Jesus was John the Baptist resurrected. So, even assuming the reliability of the Gospels, Gavin's claim regarding lack of a Jewish precedent for individual bodily resurrection in the middle of history is false. The next claim I want to survey from Gavin is related to the falsifiability of events tied to Jesus' resurrection recorded in the Gospels.
People hearing Mark's gospel could say, wait a second, my uncle was on the Sanhedrin. There was nobody named Joseph of Arimathea. Or they could say, I remember the death of Jesus. Joseph didn't take the body, it was just left up on the cross. You see, this is making the story falsifiable. It's like if you imagine that you're making up a story that in 1992 you climbed Mount Everest. And you really didn't do that, but you're just making this up. The last thing you're going to do is say that you climbed Mount Everest with Senator Ted Kennedy or basketball player Dennis Rodman, because people know that person. And it makes it much more falsifiable because people can say, wait a second, Ted Kennedy, the senator, he never went to climb Mount Everest. I remember that. That was only 35 years ago or something, you know. Same with Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the Sanhedrin. If you're inventing the story, the way to do it is leave the barrier unnamed, right? Just say it was a soldier, a random person, whatever. And you might say, it's 30 years later. People aren't going to remember what happened. But if you were alive in the 90s, you remember what was going on in the 1990s. You know, I mentioned Dennis Rodman. I like the Chicago Bulls, right? You remember stuff back then. Remember, crucifixions are public events intended to be a deterrent. So this is not done in a private corner of Jerusalem. The whole point is to make an example out of this person for everybody to see. Now, Jesus had a lot of loyal followers, his family members, his mom. People would have been very interested in him being crucified. And if you can just make things up in a public circulating document about this event, it is falsifiable. People can correct you based upon what they remember. So it's not at all crazy to think that Mark is just telling us the truth.
In highlighting this clip, my aim is not to challenge Gavin's claim about the historicity of Joseph of Arimathea. I happen to believe that the story of Joseph of Arimathea is not completely implausible. Rather, my issue with Gavin's argument in the preceding clip is centered around his claims of falsifiability. Gavin claims that making things up in a public circulating document is falsifiable because the claims made in those documents can be checked and potentially falsified by those who know the facts of the event itself. While Gavin's claim here is technically correct, to what extent is it relevant with respect to the Gospels? Keep in mind that the Gospels were written decades after the events they record, in a language other than Jesus and his followers spoke, and were written for audiences of a Hellenistic Jewish and Gentile variety. So, there were significant barriers to any sort of quote-unquote fact-checking that could be accomplished by any Hellenistic Jews or Gentiles who came across the Jesus tradition. For example, apologists often make this claim of falsifiability with regards to the creed in 1 Corinthians 15, wherein Paul states, "Then he, Jesus, appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died." Because Paul identified that a multitude of witnesses to Jesus' resurrection were still alive, apologists claim that this is compelling evidence of veracity for the resurrection because the witnesses could still be consulted and the claim could be falsified. Again, while this is technically true, it's not at all pragmatically compelling. Recall that the Apostle Paul is writing to believers in Corinth, which was 800 miles away from Jerusalem. What were believers in Corinth to do? Travel 800 miles to Jerusalem, especially when such a trip would have been dangerous, expensive, and incredibly time-consuming, and interview people in Jerusalem despite the fact that Paul never mentioned a single name of any of the 500 who supposedly saw Jesus? Moreover, if one was already a believer in what Paul preached, then why would they feel the need to check his facts in such an inconvenient manner in the first place? These Christians already believed, so what need is there for falsification? Now, even though Gavin's point wasn't directly predicated on Paul's letters, the point remains appropriately germane to Gavin's argument about the Gospels. The Gospels, being publicly circulating documents capable of falsifiability, means relatively little pragmatically. Again, the Gospels were written decades after the events they record, for demographics that were not situated in Galilee or Jerusalem. So how exactly was one supposed to check the veracity of the claims in the Gospels? Were they simply supposed to take a trip to Jerusalem and hope that they ran into eyewitnesses of the events recorded 40 years ago? Another important thing to keep in mind is that Mark was written directly before or during the Jewish revolt from 66 to 74 CE. Hence, Jerusalem wasn't exactly the appropriate place to be conducting interviews of eyewitnesses to the events of Jesus' life, assuming, of course, that eyewitnesses were still in abundance and were easily located. And even if all these obstacles were overcome and eyewitnesses were interviewed, there remain many events in the Gospels and the resurrection accounts that simply seem impossible to verify or falsify. How would one, for example, falsify the account in Matthew 27 of the mass resurrected saints? If one conducted interviews with supposed witnesses who were in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus' death, and they claimed not to have seen the resurrected saints, does that falsify Matthew's account? Well, no. It could simply be the case that these particular individuals didn't witness the event, and it certainly wouldn't follow that Matthew's account had been falsified. The cherry on top of all these considerations that call Gavin's argument into question is this. People in antiquity weren't exactly known for their skepticism. While Gavin claims that the events in the Gospels were easily falsifiable, ancient peoples were not typically of the mindset to rigorously investigate historical claims to verify or falsify. The ancient historian Tacitus famously stated that everything gets exaggerated is typical for any story. All the greatest events are obscure. While some people accept whatever they hear as beyond doubt, others twist the truth into its opposite, and both errors grow over subsequent generations. Thus, Gavin's notion of falsifiability seems to assume a standard of skepticism that the ancient world didn't exactly abide by. It would appear then that Gavin's argument regarding the ability of individuals to falsify events in the Gospels is not compelling. Now, here's where I want to begin to make a case for why, even granting Gavin's 3 facts, his case for the resurrection remains feeble. Let's briefly survey some remarks Gavin makes about the testimonies to the resurrection.
But what I want to highlight here is that the willingness to experience persecution is only one piece of the pie that gives these early testimonies about the resurrection the kind of endearing quality. I like calling it that. I like these early testimonies. They seem believable. Okay, I like them. I feel defensive. I feel that the early testimonies about the resurrection are often interpreted cynically. It's like people are just taking a club, and if they can knock off anything, they will do so. And I feel defensive of these early testimonies and the way you feel about a friend who is trustworthy and is being unjustly disbelieved. And you say, why don't you, he's a trustworthy person, this kind of feeling. That's how I feel about them.
So, Gavin believes that the testimonies to the resurrection are trustworthy and quote-unquote seem believable. Yet the reasons he supplies for these beliefs are the reasons we already surveyed and found to be wanting regarding the falsifiability of the gospel narratives. Another reason Gavin supplies is found in the fact that the Gospels don't portray the eyewitnesses in a flattering light.
It's striking how the followers of Jesus are not portrayed sympathetically in these writings. They consistently lack faith, fail to understand Jesus' purposes. They abandon him in his final hour. Peter, the chief apostle, denies Christ at the crucial moment multiple times. When Jesus is risen, many of them don't believe in Luke 24:11 and Matthew as well. So this doesn't seem like the kind of thing that is likely to be made up. It gives a kind of, again, I say an endearing quality, a kind of credibility when the leaders of this movement are willing to look like idiots to get their message out there. This is sometimes called the criterion of embarrassment. Basically means stories or sayings that would have embarrassed the early church are less likely to have been made up. They're more likely to have been accurate.
The major issue here is that Gavin seems to be erecting a false dichotomy between the gospel narratives either being trustworthy and sincere or else being made up. He makes this error again when discussing the aforementioned issue of the Jewish belief in resurrection.
So all we're saying so far is this belief going back to the 30s AD in a bodily resurrection seems to have been, in the main, sincere. It doesn't seem like an intentional deception. Very unlikely that the people proclaiming this are lying and making up this very embarrassing message that they're then dying for, in some cases at least.
Again, what Gavin is promulgating are not mutually exclusive options. The Gospels aren't either sincere, trustworthy testimony or else they must be intentional fabrications. A third option is that the Gospels have been colored by legend. That is to say, the gospel narratives might be untrustworthy, but not because they were fabricated whole cloth, but rather because they are the result of psychological and anthropological factors leading to legendary development. And we have a plethora of reasons to believe this to be the case. First, the gospel accounts themselves, primarily the resurrection accounts, are incredibly contradictory. The Gospels don't unambiguously or consistently answer any of the following questions that present themselves upon reading. How many angels were at the tomb? Where and when did they appear, and what did they say and do? Did the women tell the disciples about the tomb before or after they encountered the angels, and at what point did the women encounter the risen Jesus? Were the disciples instructed to go to Galilee or not? Could the risen Jesus be touched or not? Which of the disciples first encountered the risen Jesus? Was Jesus' first appearance to the disciples in Galilee or Jerusalem? There are no straightforward and consistent answers to these questions. Any answer that favors one gospel will necessarily cast doubt on the others. And even though attempted harmonizations of these accounts exist, many are convoluted and unconvincing and usually still require that at least one narrative account has added or left out significant details, which results in the reader being left in the dark. So, why exactly is it that in the most important narratives in all the New Testament, we can't grasp a clear understanding of the events that took place as well as their chronology? Should one view these confused and perplexing narratives as sincere and trustworthy eyewitness testimony, as Gavin does, or should we instead view them as likely the result of sociological and anthropological factors that affect religious movements of charismatic leaders that inevitably lend themselves to legendary development? This naturally leads us to the next reason that we have for casting doubt on the gospel's trustworthiness, and it's an important issue concerning the Jesus tradition that apologists like Gavin usually fail to consider. The issue is predicated on precisely how much we don't know about all the factors and traditions that led to and produced the narratives that we have in the gospels decades later. We don't have confident answers to any of the following questions. How was the Jesus tradition viewed among all disciples? Did they all agree, or was there any dissonance or differences in understanding in what they perceived? Was the collective Jesus tradition affected by various psychological and anthropological factors that usually affect groups with fervent adherents, such as collective memory, herd mentality, group-enforced confirmation bias, the polarization effect, and group reinforcement? Who specifically spearheaded the early transmission of the Jesus tradition, and how faithful and reliable were their perceptions of what transpired? How early was a structured oral tradition put into practice, and how malleable was the Jesus tradition before this happened? How malleable was the oral tradition in the decades that preceded this tradition finally being placed into a written medium? How easy was it to modify the Jesus tradition, and what exactly was modified? And how faithful to this tradition did the gospel writers remain? These are all incredibly relevant and pertinent questions regarding the transmission of the Jesus tradition, which includes the resurrection narratives, and we have no concrete answers to them whatsoever. We're largely in the dark for an entire 40-year period. There are simply too many things we don't know about the propagation of the Jesus tradition for anyone to be confident in its reliability. Our lack of clear understanding behind the transmission of the Jesus tradition should foster a sense of cautious yet balanced skepticism when assessing the Gospels. And this is why Gavin's naive disposition to trust the Gospels like he would a friend of his seems irrational and misplaced.
And I feel defensive of these early testimonies in the way you feel about a friend who is trustworthy and is being unjustly disbelieved. And you say, why aren't you, he's a trustworthy person, this kind of feeling. That's how I feel about that.
Based on what we've surveyed so far, I think one can understand why Gavin's unwavering confidence in the reliability and trustworthiness of the gospel narratives is rationally inappropriate. Nevertheless, I'll let the viewer reach their own conclusions. Let's finally survey how Gavin assesses rival explanations for his three facts that form the foundation for the case of the resurrection. I was quite thrilled to see Gavin put forward a competing naturalistic hypothesis that I actually believe to be quite plausible.
So let's focus on the best alternative explanations. And I'm going to put forward the one that I think is to my mind the most plausible naturalistic alternative explanation. Supposing Jesus did not in fact die, how do we explain these three facts? One possibility is, number one, the body was stolen by robbers. From what I'm reading, grave robbery was not totally common, but it did happen sometimes. And number two, there's a series of hallucinations producing belief in the resurrection.
I personally find this hypothesis, which posits two separate explanations for two separate facts, to be extremely plausible. First, as Gavin articulates in the clip, grave theft was a common enough occurrence in Rome to take seriously as a possible cause of a tomb being empty. Even Christian scholar and apologist N.T. Wright admits in his book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, that graves were robbed often. Moreover, there's a famous Roman artifact known as the Nazareth inscription, dated to right around the time of Jesus, which clearly prohibits grave robbery. It states, "Ordinance of Caesar, it is my pleasure that graves and tombs which have been made for the purpose of the repose of those who have been laid to rest should remain undisturbed in perpetuity. If anyone is found to have opened a tomb or removed bodies or maliciously transferred them elsewhere or disturbed the seals of the tomb, it is my will that such a person be put to death for violating the sanctity of the sepulchre. Let it be preserved in all respects as the resting place of the dead." In this inscription, we witness unambiguously the prohibition of disturbing seals of a tomb, removing the body, and transferring it elsewhere. The fact that a prohibitory inscription needed to be made in the first place entails that this practice was common enough that it was an issue. Moreover, dead bodies were many times stolen by necromancers for use in divination and incantation rituals. Because of that, the dead body of a supposed holy man like that of Jesus would be all the more enticing to steal. On top of this, according to scholars, necromancers also coveted bodies of those who had died a violent death. So clearly, if anyone would have been a candidate for their tomb to be robbed, it was Jesus. Thus, the hypothesis of grave robbery seems sufficient and adequate to account for an empty tomb. However, the explanatory work is not complete, as one still needs to account for Gavin's second fact that the followers of Jesus had experiences leading them to believe that he rose from the dead. To address and explain this fact is the hypothesis of hallucinations. Gavin explains.
So, in other words, mere grave robbery only gets you halfway, arguably not halfway, not even that. It only gets you part of the way. You have to add on an additional explanation of hallucinations to get the rest of the way, to explain why are people believing they have seen Jesus bodily.
So, positing that a number of Jesus' followers, whether a couple of disciples and some of the women that followed Jesus, including possibly James and eventually Paul, had bereavement visions or hallucinations of Jesus, coupled with the tomb that was empty due to grave theft, is the collective hypothesis that Gavin is considering. How well does this alternative explanation hold up in Gavin's estimations?
And so the point is, this is a lot of hallucinations or some other kind of experiences that are unexpected, all leading different people to the same unexpected belief for which many of them are willing to die. And what I'm suggesting is, unless your prior beliefs absolutely rule out miracles, if you're looking at the historical evidence, at a certain point this question arises. Are all these hallucinations following a grave robbery really more likely than a miracle? At what point, as you're studying, do the scales tip from like 60-40 to now I added on a few more hallucinations, now it's like 45-55 the other way, right?
Gavin asks a pertinent question. Are all these hallucinations following a grave robbery really more likely than a miracle? Now, I myself am not a naturalist, so I'm certainly not averse to the idea of miracles. Nevertheless, we know graves were robbed in Rome, frequently enough that the practice was explicitly outlawed, and we know that people are susceptible to grief-induced visions and hallucinations. We know for a fact that these things occur. Can we say the same for resurrections? Absolutely not. Moreover, given that the testimony we have is riddled with inconsistencies and discrepancies, so much so that we can't even plot out a clear chronological narrative that reliably adheres to all testimony, And given the fact that the propagation of the Jesus tradition is obscure enough to warrant skepticism, and given the fact that the supposed event of the resurrection took place during a cultural milieu where these types of stories were ubiquitous and people's levels of gullibility and superstition were significantly elevated, I just don't see how it's reasonable to affirm the resurrection over a naturalistic explanation such as this. This disposition is not the result of a bias against the supernatural or the miraculous. It's merely a measured skepticism that understands the extent regarding how pernicious and pliable the human psyche is, especially when placed in suggestible groups in fervent religious movements. While Gavin attempts to present a compelling case for the resurrection of Jesus, his arguments ultimately fall short when scrutinized against historical, textual, and anthropological considerations. Even granting the empty tomb and the other facts he puts forward, Gavin's take on the resurrection hypothesis is grounded in a credulous and, in my view, mistaken belief in the endearing and trustworthy nature of the testimony of the Jesus tradition. The naturalistic explanation of grave robbery paired with bereavement hallucinations offers a much more plausible account, grounded in well-documented phenomena without requiring the extraordinary claim of a resurrection. While Gavin's sincere and charitable approach are admirable, the arguments he provides do not sufficiently overcome the hurdles of skepticism and naturalistic explanations. Ultimately, Gavin's case for the resurrection remains unconvincing. Thanks for watching.